October 1646. The streets of Intramuros are quiet, but not with the quietness of peace. It is the quietness of fear, the kind that settles over a city when it knows what is coming but cannot stop it. Inside the church of Santo Domingo, hundreds of Manileños are on their knees, women clutching rosary beads, children pressed against their mothers, old men who survived earthquakes and typhoons now praying with a desperation they have never known before. Outside, the harbor of Cavite is nearly empty. There are no warships, no battle fleet, no reinforcements from Mexico, nothing but two old cargo galleons, their wooden hulls already beginning to rot, their cannons borrowed from wherever they could be found. And somewhere out in the Philippine seas, 18 Dutch warships are closing in. They are the finest vessels of the most powerful naval force on Earth. They carry hundreds of cannons, they carry hundreds of soldiers, and they carry a single, clear objective: take Manila, destroy Spanish power in Asia, and turn these Catholic islands into a Protestant colony. By every measure of military logic, this should not even be a fight. It should be a surrender. What happens next, however, will become one of the most extraordinary chapters in the history of faith. 5 naval battles over 7 months, 5 victories for the defenders, and only 15 men lost on the Filipino-Spanish side across all 5 engagements. When it is over, the church will conduct a formal investigation. Witnesses will testify, theologians will deliberate, and the official verdict will use a word that, once spoken, can never be taken back: miracle. This is the story of Our Lady of La Naval de Manila. And whether you believe in miracles or not, what happened in these waters in 1646 deserves to be remembered, not just as Catholic history, not just as Filipino history, but as one of the most improbable military outcomes in the entire recorded history of naval warfare. Let us begin. To understand why 18 Dutch warships were sailing toward Manila in 1646, we need to go back nearly a century, and we need to go to Europe. In 1568, the provinces that we now call the Netherlands began a war of independence against the Spanish crown. This was not a small border conflict. It would become one of the longest wars in European history, the 80 Years' War, lasting from 1568 to 1648. It was a war over territory, over religion, over commerce, and over the very idea of national sovereignty. The Dutch provinces were largely Protestant Calvinist, to be specific, and they were fighting against Catholic Spain, the most powerful empire on earth. And as the war dragged on decade after decade, the Dutch realized something crucial. You did not defeat Spain only on European battlefields. Spain's true power came from its global empire, from the gold of the Americas, from the spices of Asia, from the trade routes that connected Manila to Acapulco to Seville. If you could cut those lifelines, you could bleed Spain to death slowly, from the edges inward. And so, in 1602, the Dutch did something revolutionary. They created the Verenigd Oostindische Company, the VOC. The Dutch East India Company. This was not merely a trading company. It was a war machine disguised as a business. The VOC had the legal authority to negotiate treaties, wage war, establish colonies, and govern territories. It had its own armies, its own navies, its own governors. It answered not to a king but to shareholders. And its mandate was breathtakingly simple: dominate Asian trade by any means necessary. Within 40 years, the VOC became the most powerful commercial enterprise the world had ever seen. They seized Amboina from the Portuguese in 1605. They conquered Jakarta and renamed it Batavia in 1619, making it their Asian capital. They took Malacca in 1641, breaking the spine of Portuguese power in Southeast Asia. They captured the Spanish fort in northern Formosa, present-day Taiwan, in 1642. And at every step, they followed the same pattern: arrive, negotiate. If negotiation fails, attack. If attack succeeds, establish a monopoly, move on to the next target. By the mid-1640s, the VOC controlled an arc of territory stretching from Sri Lanka to Japan. They had trading posts in India, factories in Java, forts in the Moluccas. They had driven the Portuguese from nearly every strategic position in maritime Asia. Only one major prize remained in the Western Pacific: Manila. Now, you might ask, why Manila? Why would the Dutch care about these islands? The answer lies in the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade, one of the most lucrative commercial routes in the world. Every year, 1 or 2 massive galleons would sail from Manila to Acapulco, Mexico, carrying Chinese silk, porcelain, spices, and other Asian goods. In Acapulco, these goods were exchanged for Mexican silver, the currency that powered the entire Asian economy. The galleons would then sail back to Manila, and the cycle would repeat. This single trade route generated enormous wealth for Spain and kept its Asian colony financially viable. For the Dutch, conquering Manila meant 3 things. First, it would cut Spain's lifeline to Asia. No more silver from Mexico. No more reinforcements for Spanish garrisons across the Pacific. Second, it would give the VOC control over the China trade. Manila was the hub where Chinese merchants brought their goods to exchange with European buyers. Control Manila, and you control the gateway between China and the West. And third, and this mattered deeply to the Calvinist Dutch, it would replace Catholic influence in Southeast Asia with Protestant governance. The Philippines was the only predominantly Christian nation in Asia. Taking it would be not just a military victory, but a religious one. The Dutch had been probing Philippine defenses for decades. The first Dutch squadron to reach the Philippines was led by Olivier Vignot in 1600. His ships clashed with the Spanish fleet under Antonio de Morga near Fortune Island, and the Spanish flagship San Diego sank in the battle. In 1609, another Dutch force under Francois de Witt attacked Manila, but was repelled at the Battle of Playa Honda. Throughout the 1620s and 30s, Dutch privateers harassed the coasts of Manila Bay, intercepted Chinese trading junks, and tried to choke off Manila's commerce with East Asia. But these were raids, hit-and-run operations. What the Dutch planned for 1646 was entirely different. This time, they were coming to stay. The turning point came in 1642, when the Dutch seized the Spanish fort of San Salvador in northern Formosa. This was not just another colonial outpost changing hands. It was a strategic catastrophe for Spain. From Formosa, the Dutch could project naval power directly into the Philippine Sea. They could intercept the Manila galleons before they even reached Philippine waters. They could launch raids against the coasts of Luzon, and most importantly, they could stage a full-scale invasion fleet within striking distance of Manila itself. We know how seriously the Dutch took this opportunity because of a remarkable historical witness. Fray Juan de los Angeles, a Dominican priest, had been captured by the Dutch when they took Formosa. He was taken as a prisoner of war to Makassar, in present-day Indonesia, and from Makassar, he wrote a first-hand account of what he observed among his captors. The Dutch, he reported, talked constantly about taking Manila. They discussed it openly, eagerly, almost obsessively, in his own words. They spoke among themselves of nothing else than how they would gain Manila. They had already requested more men from Holland, specifically for the purpose of attacking the Philippines. Meanwhile, in Manila, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The new Spanish Governor-General, Don Diego Fajardo Chacon, arrived in the Philippines at the end of June 1644. What he found was a colony on the verge of collapse. The treasury was empty. The garrison was undermanned. The fortifications were aging, and there was virtually no naval force to speak of. Then, in November of 1645, nature delivered its own devastating blow. A massive earthquake struck Manila, one of the worst in the city's history. Churches crumbled, government buildings collapsed, The already weakened fortifications of Intramuros suffered further damage. The people of Manila, already anxious about the Dutch threat, now found themselves living in a city of rubble. It was into this atmosphere of ruin and dread that the news arrived in February of 1646. Dutch warships had been spotted off the coasts of Ilocos and Pangasinan. In northern Luzon, the invasion had begun. Before we follow those two cargo ships into battle, we need to understand something that every person in this story already knew. Every Spanish officer, every Dominican friar, every Filipino sailor who knelt to pray before the image of the Virgin, they all carried in their hearts the memory of another impossible naval victory. A victory that had happened just 75 years earlier, in waters half a world away. On October 7th, 1571, the fleet of the Holy League, an alliance of Catholic states, assembled by Pope Pius V, met the Ottoman Turkish Armada in the Gulf of Patras, near the Greek town of Lepanto. The stakes could not have been higher if the Turks won. The entire Mediterranean would become an Ottoman lake, and the invasion of Italy itself would become inevitable. The Ottoman fleet was enormous, approximately 225 galleys, and additional smaller vessels, carrying a force of roughly 120,000 men. Pope Pius V, a Dominican friar before he became pope, did something that would echo across centuries. He ordered every church in Rome to remain open day and night. He called upon all of Christendom to pray the Rosary. The prayer that tradition holds was given by the Virgin Mary to Saint Dominic, the founder of the Dominican order, as a spiritual weapon against heresy. The Pope himself, though aged and ill, led a rosary procession through the streets of Rome. And on that October day, the Holy League won. The Ottoman fleet was shattered. Thousands of Christian galley slaves were liberated. It was the last great battle fought between rowing vessels in Western history, and it decisively shifted the balance of power in the Mediterranean from east to west. Pope Pius V attributed the victory entirely to the intercession of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Through the prayers of the Rosary, he established October 7th as the Feast of Our Lady of Victory. His successor, Gregory XIII, renamed it the Feast of Our Lady of the Rosary and assigned its celebration to the Dominicans. Now, here is the thread that connects Lepanto to Manila. The Dominican order, the same order that Saint Dominic founded, the same order that produced Pope Pius V, the same order that promoted the Rosary as a spiritual weapon, arrived in the Philippines. In 1587, they were among the first missionaries to establish themselves in Manila. They built the Church of Santo Domingo in Intramuros in 1588. They established the Confraternity of the Most Holy Rosary, actively teaching Filipinos the prayer that they believed had won Lepanto. And it was a Dominican governor's commission that created the very statue that would become the center of our story. In 1593, the Spanish Governor-General Don Luis Perez Dasmariñas commissioned a statue of Our Lady of the Rosary in memory of his recently deceased father. The work was entrusted to Captain Hernando de los Rios Coronel, who found a Chinese immigrant sculptor to carve the image. This anonymous artist was not a Christian when he began the work, but according to tradition, something happened during the carving that changed him forever. The story is told, and it is a story beloved by Filipinos for centuries, that while the Chinese sculptor was chiseling the face of the Virgin, he heard a soft, gentle female voice saying, in Spanish, "No me de tan fuerte, do not chisel me so hard, it hurts." The voice so unsettled him that he left Manila and moved to Ilocos to escape it. But he could not forget what he had heard. Eventually, he returned, asked to be baptized, and insisted that his baptism take place in front of the very statue he had created. The statue itself is remarkable, standing about 4 feet 8 inches tall. The body is carved from hardwood in the cage or bastard or style, but the face and hands of the Virgin and the entire figure of the child Jesus are carved from solid ivory. The face has distinctly Asian features, almond-shaped eyes. A gentle expression that is neither European nor purely Chinese, but something uniquely of this place. This meeting point of cultures, the child Jesus, held in the Virgin's arms, has the plump, rounded features of a Filipino baby. It is, to this day, considered the oldest dated ivory carving in the Philippines. This statue was given to the Dominican friars, who installed it in the Church of Santo Domingo, and for the next 50 years, it was venerated quietly, a beloved image in a beloved church, the object of ordinary devotion by ordinary people. No one knew, in 1593, that this statue would one day become the spiritual center of a national crisis. That the prayer it represented would be the only weapon available to a people with no weapons. That the Dominican thread running from Saint Dominic through Pope Pius V through Lepanto would extend all the way to the waters of Marinduque and the entrance of Manila Bay. But that is exactly what happened. Let us return to February 1646. When news reached Manila that Dutch warships had been sighted off Ilocos and Pangasinan, Governor General Diego Fajardo Chacon called a council of war. The meeting was brief. Because the options were painfully few, Manila had no warships. What it had were two old Manila Acapulco galleons, the Nuestra Senora de la Encarnacion, an 800-ton vessel, and the Nuestra Senora del Rosario, a 700-ton vessel. Both had arrived from Mexico the previous year. Both were cargo ships, designed for trade, not combat. Both were, by all accounts, already beginning to deteriorate. Their hulls were aging. Their rigging was worn. They were, as multiple sources described them, nearly rotting, but they were all Manila had. Governor Fajardo made the decision that would define his legacy. He ordered the two galleons to be armed for war. The Encarnacion was fitted with 34 cannons, the Rosario with 30. Fajardo appointed General Lorenzo Goldi de Orellana, a Basque officer, as commander-in-chief of the fleet. He placed the Encarnacion under Orellana's direct command, and appointed the Andalusian captain Sebastian Lopez as admiral and captain of the Rosario. The crews were assembled from whoever was available: Spanish soldiers, Filipino volunteers, and a scattering of other nationalities who called Manila home. They were not a professional navy. They were merchants, garrison soldiers, and civilians pressed into service by necessity. And here is where the spiritual dimension of this story takes center stage. The Dominican friars who served as chaplains aboard each vessel did something extraordinary. They did not merely offer prayers before departure. They organized a systematic spiritual campaign. Every man aboard was urged to confess his sins and receive Holy Communion. Two Dominican priests were assigned to each ship. They instructed the crews to pray the Rosary together every day, not privately and silently, but aloud, on their knees, into alternating choirs, before an image of Our Lady of the Rosary. One sailor aboard the Rosario even built a small altar below deck and placed upon it an image of the Virgin. Governor Fajardo, meanwhile, issued his own orders for Manila. He directed that the Blessed Sacrament be exposed continuously in the Royal Military Chapel, and in every church and chapel in the city for as long as the fleet remained at sea and in contact with the enemy. Manila City, still bearing the scars of the 1645 earthquake, was to become a city of unceasing prayer. On March 3, 1646, the two galleons sailed from the port of Cavite. They sailed toward the most powerful naval force in Southeast Asia, carrying borrowed cannons, patched hulls, and rosary beads. The first engagement came on March 15th, in the waters near Mariveles Island, close to Corregidor at the entrance to Manila Bay. The two Spanish Filipino galleons encountered the first Dutch squadron, 4 large warships, and 1 smaller vessel. The Dutch ships were purpose-built warships, heavily armed, crewed by professional sailors and soldiers. They outgunned and outnumbered the defenders. What followed defied expectation. The Encarnacion and Rosario engaged the Dutch aggressively, exchanging cannon fire throughout the day. When night fell, the Dutch withdrew. No one on the Spanish Filipino side had been lost. According to reports that later reached Manila, the Dutch sustained significant casualties, and 2 of their ships were so badly damaged that they were rendered useless for further combat. When the 2 galleons returned to port, the crews immediately fulfilled the vow they had made before sailing. They walked barefoot through the streets of Manila to the church of Santo Domingo, where they knelt before the image of Our Lady of the Rosary and offered their thanksgiving. It was a promising start, but everyone knew the Dutch would be back. After the first battle, the Spanish Filipino fleet was dispatched to the Embocadero de San Bernardino, the strait, through which the annual galleon from Mexico would arrive. Protecting this galleon, laden with silver and supplies, was essential for the colony's survival. While waiting near the island of Ticao, the 2 ships found themselves blockaded by a second Dutch squadron of 7 warships, including 2 fire ships. A fire ship was one of the most feared weapons in 17th century naval warfare, a vessel packed with combustible materials and explosives, designed to be steered into an enemy ship and set ablaze. It was, in essence, a floating weapon of destruction. For more than a month, the Dutch maintained the blockade. Then, calculating that the merchant galleon from Mexico might be approaching Manila from another direction, the Dutch squadron sailed toward the capital. General Orellana, with his 2 battered galleons, gave chase on July 28, 1646. The 2 Spanish Filipino ships caught up with the 7 Dutch warships in the waters between the islands of Banten and Marinduque. No immediate fighting occurred. Both sides were positioning for advantage. And then something happened that the historical sources treat with particular significance. Before the battle began, General Orellana aboard the Encarnacion and Admiral Lopez aboard the Rosario, each without knowing what the other was doing independently, made public vows to the Virgin of the Rosary. Each man, on his own ship, in front of his own crew, pledged that if they emerged victorious, the entire armada would celebrate a solemn feast in the Virgin's honor, and every man would walk barefoot to her chapel at the Church of Santo Domingo, as a sign of gratitude. To commanders, to ships, one identical vow, made simultaneously and independently. The chroniclers note this coincidence with particular wonder. The second battle erupted on the evening of July 29th. At approximately 7 in the evening, it was the fiercest engagement of the entire campaign. 7 Dutch ships formed a ring around the Encarnacion, pouring cannon fire from every direction. The Spanish flagship fought back with everything it had, sustaining heavy bombardment while inflicting what the sources describe as greater damage on the attackers. Meanwhile, the Rosario found itself outside the circle of Dutch ships. Admiral Lopez used this position brilliantly, firing freely into the rear of the Dutch formation, striking ships that were focused on the Encarnacion and could not easily return fire. The bombardment continued through the night, the darkness lit by muzzle flashes and the glow of burning rigging. By dawn, the Dutch had had enough. They withdrew once again. 6 men had been lost on the Spanish Filipino side, a number that, given the intensity of the engagement, struck even contemporaries as remarkably low. The very next day, July 31st, 1646, the Spanish Filipino fleet pursued the retreating Dutch, who now had only 6 vessels remaining, including 1 fire ship. They caught up with the enemy between the islands of Mindoro and Nesta de Campo, a small island about 20 kilometers southeast of Mindoro. This time, it was the defenders who took the offensive. The 2 galleons pressed the attack while the Dutch fought desperately to hold their formation. One contemporary narrator described the bombardment between the 2 fleets with a phrase that captures the sheer ferocity of the exchange. It became furious, like the explosion of so many volcanoes. The Dutch, growing desperate, deployed their last remaining fire ship, This was a formidable weapon. It carried 30 cannons and was packed with explosives, but it had no sails of its own and had to be towed into position by smaller Dutch launches. General Orellana, recognizing the threat, ordered his musketeers to concentrate fire on the men manning the launches. At the same time, he directed the artillery on the starboard side of the Encarnacion to fire continuously at the approaching fireship. The fireship was battered, riddled with shot, and sank before it could reach its target, taking its crew and its deadly cargo to the bottom. As the vessel disappeared beneath the waves, the men aboard the Spanish flagship erupted in shouts that ring across the centuries. Ave Maria and Viva la Fe de Cristo y la Virgen Santísima del Rosario. Long live the faith of Christ and the Most Holy Virgin of the Rosary. The battle continued until the Angelus at 6 in the evening. Once again, the Dutch fled into the night, their force now severely diminished. When the two galleons returned to Manila, the people of the city had already given them a name. They called them the Galleons of the Miracle. General Orellana, his body exhausted from months at sea, retired from service. Governor Fajardo rewarded him with one of the finest estates in the islands. With Orellana's retirement, the command structure was reorganized. Sebastian Lopez, the former admiral of the Rosario, was promoted to commander-in-chief of the fleet and transferred to the Encarnacion. Agustin de Cepeda was elevated from sergeant major to admiral and given command of the Rosario. The Spanish Filipino fleet was also reinforced. A newly built galleon, the San Diego, was added to the force, along with a galley and for brigantines. It was still a tiny force by European standards, but it was 3 times larger than the 2-ship fleet that had fought the first 3 battles. Governor Fajardo ordered that the vow made during the previous battles be renewed, and that the practice of praying the Rosary aloud into choirs before the image of Our Lady continue throughout the fleet. By September of 1646, there were still Dutch ships in Philippine waters. A 3rd squadron of 6 vessels had been dispatched to reinforce the first 2. But unbeknownst to them, those earlier squadrons had already been defeated. 3 of the 6 ships were prowling the waters near Manila, waiting on September 16th, 1646. The Spanish Filipino fleet sailed toward Fortune Island, where Dutch presence had been reported. The enemy was gone from there, but sailing further toward Mindoro, they spotted the Dutch corsairs between the islands of Ambal and Lubang. The 4th battle began at approximately 4 in the afternoon. But nature was not cooperating. The wind blew against the Spanish Filipino fleet, making it extremely difficult to close the distance with the enemy. For 5 hours, the 2 sides exchanged long-range cannon fire, a grueling bombardment that tested the endurance of every man aboard. Then, at around 9 in the evening, the currents intervened. The Rosario, carried by a powerful drift, found itself pushed directly into the middle of the 3 Dutch ships. Admiral Cepeda and his crew were suddenly surrounded, outgunned, and alone. This should have been the moment the defenders' luck ran out. Surrounded by 3 purpose-built warships, the old galleon Rosario should have been overwhelmed. Instead, Cepeda and his men fought with a determination that astonished even themselves. The Rosario held off all 3 Dutch ships until the Encarnacion could close the distance and relieve the pressure. Once again, the Dutch withdrew. The final engagement came on October 4th, 1646, the feast day of St. Francis of Assisi, the Saint of Peace. The circumstances were particularly dangerous. The 3 Spanish Filipino galleons had become separated by strong currents. The San Diego was moored at Marivals with the galley and brigantines. The Encarnacion was anchored at the entrance to Manila Bay, and the Rosario had been carried 2 or 3 leagues away by irresistible currents. The 3 Dutch ships, seeing the defenders scattered, sensed an opportunity and attacked. These were large, Well-armed vessels, the Dutch flagship alone carried over 40 cannons on its sides, not counting additional artillery on its forecastle and quarterdeck. What followed was a chaotic, swirling engagement in which each Spanish Filipino ship fought independently, unable to support the others. And yet, one by one, each held its ground. The Encarnacion absorbed tremendous punishment, but gave back as much as it received. The Rosario, despite being isolated, fought off Dutch attempts to close and board. Even the San Diego, originally built as a merchant vessel and now pressed into its first combat, acquitted itself with courage. By the time the engagement ended, the Dutch had sustained enough damage to convince them that Manila was not going to fall. Not today. Not ever. They gathered their battered ships and sailed away from Philippine waters. They never returned. Across 5 naval battles spanning 7 months from March to October of 1646, the defenders of Manila had achieved the seemingly impossible. To rotting cargo ships, later reinforced by one newly built galleon, had repelled an invasion force of 18 warships divided into 3 squadrons. The total number of defenders lost across all 5 battles was 15 men. The Dutch had come to conquer a nation. They left having conquered nothing. The question that hung over Manila, the question that hung over the entire Philippines, was simple. How? There is an aspect of this story that is often overlooked, and it deserves its own telling. When the first Dutch squadron arrived in Ilocos and Pangasinan in early 1646, they did not come only with cannons, they came with promises. The Dutch offered the local Filipino population complete independence from Spanish rule. They promised the abolition of all taxes. They presented themselves as liberators, come to free the Filipinos from the burden of colonial government. It was a shrewd strategy, and in other parts of Southeast Asia, it had worked. Indigenous populations, resentful of European colonizers, had welcomed the Dutch as an alternative. But in Ilocos and Pangasinan, something different happened. The Ilocanos and Pangasinenses refused. They rejected the Dutch offer and resisted the invaders. And when the Dutch, angered by this rejection, turned to force and began plundering homes and villages, the local population held firm until Spanish reinforcements arrived to drive the Dutch back to their ships. Why did they refuse? This is a question worth pausing over, because the answer tells us something profound about what 80 years of Catholic evangelization had accomplished in the Philippines. When the first Spanish missionaries arrived in 1565, the Philippines was a patchwork of indigenous belief systems, with Islam making inroads from the south. By 1646, just 80 years later, Catholicism had become so deeply woven into the fabric of Filipino life that many communities chose to fight alongside their Spanish colonizers rather than accept freedom from a Protestant power. This was not blind obedience. The Ilocanos and Pangasinenses knew perfectly well what colonial rule meant: the labor demands, the taxes, the restrictions on their traditional ways of life. They chose to endure those burdens rather than abandon the faith that had become part of who they were. And it was not only on land that Filipinos shaped the outcome. The chronicles repeatedly describe the crews of the Encarnacion and Rosario as including large contingents of native Filipino volunteers. These were not conscripts. They were men who chose to board those rotting galleons, knowing full well what they were sailing into. They prayed the Rosary alongside Spanish soldiers. They manned the cannons. They repaired the rigging under fire. And when the battles were won, they walked barefoot through the streets of Intramuros to give thanks at Santo Domingo, just as their Spanish officers did. The battles of Naval were not simply a Spanish military achievement on Filipino soil. They were a shared act of faith by a community that, despite all the imperfections of colonial rule, had found in Catholicism something worth fighting for, something worth praying for, something worth walking barefoot through the streets for. Here is something that distinguishes the Catholic approach to claimed miracles from what many people assume. The Catholic Church does not simply accept miraculous claims at face value. It investigates them. It questions them. It applies a process of scrutiny that, in many ways, resembles a judicial inquiry more than an act of devotion. On April 6, 1647, less than a year after the final battle, Fray Diego Rodriguez, the Procurator General of the Dominican Order, formally petitioned the Vicar of the Diocese of Manila to declare that the victories of 1646 had been achieved through the miraculous intercession of the Virgin of the Rosary. What followed was not a rubber stamp approval. It was a thorough canonical investigation. An ecclesiastical council was convened in Cavite, composed of doctors of theology, experts in canon law, and prominent religious figures. Witnesses were called and examined, not just officers and clergy, but ordinary sailors and civilians. Both written depositions and oral testimony were gathered and evaluated. The council was looking for evidence that went beyond pious feeling. They needed to establish that the victories could not be adequately explained by natural military factors alone, and they identified 3 specific circumstances that, taken together, pointed towards something beyond the ordinary. First, across all 5 naval battles, only 15 defenders had been lost. Given the intensity of the engagements, multiple ships firing at close range over extended periods, including nighttime battles in confined waters, this casualty figure was, by any standard of 17th century naval warfare, extraordinarily low. Second, the 2 primary vessels of the Spanish Filipino fleet, the Encarnacion and the Rosario, were old, deteriorating cargo ships, not warships. They were, in the words of the investigation, already very old and powerless to do battle. The fact that they had not only survived 5 engagements, but had repeatedly driven off purpose-built Dutch warships was, in itself, difficult to explain through normal military analysis. Third, the soldiers and sailors themselves, from the highest-ranking general to the lowest-ranking crew member, unanimously attributed their survival and victory to divine assistance, obtained through the intercession of Our Lady of the Rosary. They had prayed the Rosary continuously throughout the campaign. They had made public vows. They had organized their spiritual life aboard the ships with the same discipline. They applied to their military duties, and they believed, without exception, that it was this spiritual discipline, not their military skill, that had carried them through. On April 9th, 1652, after 5 years of investigation, the Venerable Dean and Chapter of the Archdiocese of Manila issued their formal declaration. The 5 battles fought by the 2 galleons under Catholic arms against the Dutch enemies, they proclaimed, were and should be upheld as miraculous, granted by the sovereign majesty of God through the intercession of the Most Holy Virgin Our Lady and her devotion, the Holy Rosary. Permission was given for the victories to be celebrated, preached, and held in festivities, and to be recorded among the miracles performed by Our Lady of the Rosary, for the greater devotion of the faithful. From that day forward, the image of the Virgin in the Church of Santo Domingo was known by a new name. She was no longer simply Our Lady of the Rosary. She was Our Lady of the Most Holy Rosary, La Naval de Manila. The word naval from the tradition of Our Lady as the helper of Catholic navies, first established at Lepanto, was permanently added to her title, and the feast that the sailors had vowed to celebrate if they survived began to be observed every year on the 2nd Sunday of October. It has been observed continuously, without a single interruption, for nearly 400 years. The story of La Naval did not end with the declaration of 1652. Over the following centuries, 5 popes would formally honor the image and the devotion it inspired, elevating what began as a local miracle into a matter of significance for the Universal Church. In 1903, Pope Leo XIII, known as the Rosary Pope for his deep devotion to the prayer, wrote a letter to the Archbishop of Manila, Jeremiah James Harty, in it. He issued an exhortation for the faithful to make pilgrimages to the Virgin's shrine at Santo Domingo Church. "Go to the temple of Santo Domingo," the Pope wrote, "to the sanctuary of the excellence of the Most Holy Virgin of the Rosary in the Philippines, to the place where your elders bent their knees to give thanks to her who liberated these islands." In 1906, Pope Pius X authorized a canonical coronation for the statue, a rare and significant honor in the Catholic tradition, reserved for images associated with extraordinary graces. The coronation was performed on October 5, 1907, by the Apostolic Delegate to the Philippines, Archbishop Dom Ambrose Agius. In 1946, the 300th anniversary of the battles, Pope Pius XII sent an apostolic letter titled Filipinos Insulis, formally commemorating the tricentenary and the miraculous nature of the events. In 1973, Pope Paul VI proclaimed Our Lady of La Naval as the patroness of Quezon City, where the statue had been enshrined since 1954 in the new Santo Domingo Church. And in 1981, Pope John Paul II made perhaps the most sweeping gesture of all. Using a replica of the La Naval statue, he dedicated the entire continent of Asia to Our Lady of the Most Holy Rosary. The next day, he blessed the original image in a public mass. In a single act, the Pope who would become a saint connected the Philippines' most beloved Marian image to the spiritual destiny of the largest continent on Earth. 5 popes for centuries. One consistent message. What happened in these waters in 1646 was not forgotten by Rome. It was affirmed, honored, and held up as a sign of the Virgin's continuing protection over the Filipino people, and, through them, over all of Asia. The image of Our Lady of La Naval has survived earthquake, fire, war, and revolution. Her journey through the centuries mirrors the journey of the Philippines itself. The first church of Santo Domingo was a simple structure of wood and bamboo, consecrated on New Year's Day, 1588. In the young walled city of Intramuros, over the following centuries, the church was destroyed and rebuilt multiple times, claimed by fires, shaken by earthquakes, always rising again. By the late 19th century, the Santo Domingo Church in Intramuros had become a magnificent neo-Gothic structure, designed by the Filipino architect Felix Roxas Sr., with interior woodwork by the master carver Isabelo Tampinco work. That was considered the highest achievement of wood carving in the history of the Philippines. Through every destruction and rebuilding, the ivory statue survived. It was as if the image refused to be separated from the people who venerated it. Then came the catastrophe of the Second World War, when the Japanese invaded the Philippines in December of 1941. Church authorities acted quickly. The statue was hidden in an underground vault and later transferred to the University of Santo Tomas. For safekeeping, it remained there throughout the Japanese occupation. While around it, the city of Manila was being torn apart. The Battle of Manila in 1945 was one of the most destructive urban battles of the entire war. Intramuros was reduced to rubble. The beautiful neo-Gothic Santo Domingo Church, with its Tampinco woodwork and its centuries of memories, was destroyed completely, but the statue was safe, sheltered within the thick walls of the university. In 1946, the 300th anniversary of the battles, the statue was brought out of hiding and publicly enthroned. In 1954, it was transferred to a new Santo Domingo church, the sixth to bear that name, built in Quezon City. This is where Our Lady of La Naval resides today, in the National Shrine of Our Lady of the Most Holy Rosary, a towering modern church on Quezon Avenue that houses the silent witness to for centuries of Filipino faith. The Philippine government designated the statue and its shrine as a national cultural treasure in 2012, formally recognizing what the Filipino people had known all along. This image is not merely a religious object. It is a repository of national memory. It is the physical embodiment of a faith that has endured colonialism, earthquake, invasion, occupation, and revolution. The story of La Naval would already be extraordinary if it ended in 1652, or in 1946, or in 1981 when the Pope dedicated Asia to the Rosary. But it does not end there, because in February of 1986, the spirit of La Naval walked the streets once more. The Philippines in the mid-1980s was a nation in crisis. For 20 years, the country had been under authoritarian rule. Political freedoms had been curtailed, dissent was dangerous, and a growing movement of ordinary citizens, many of them deeply Catholic, was demanding change. On February 22, 1986, events reached a breaking point. Key military leaders broke with the government, and the Archbishop of Manila, Jaime Cardinal Sin, went on Radio Veritas, their Catholic radio station, to issue a call that would change history. "My dear people, I wish you to pray," the Cardinal said, "because it is only through prayer that we may solve this problem." He urged Filipinos to gather peacefully along Epifanio de los Santos Avenue EDSA, the main highway of Metro Manila, and to bring with them the only weapons that mattered, their faith and their rosaries. Millions responded. They came from every walk of life: workers, students, professionals, mothers with children, nuns, priests, the old and the young. They brought flowers, food, transistor radios, and rosary beads. They formed human barricades, and when military tanks advanced toward them, they did not run. They knelt in the road and prayed. And in the early days of the uprising, from the Church of Santo Domingo in Quezon City, the Dominican friars brought out the Caligari, the processional statue of the Virgin of La Naval. Fathers Isaias Tionco, Pablo Chong, Edmund Nance, Honorato Castigador, and other Dominican priests and seminarians escorted the image through the streets, making their way to EDSA, to the very heart of the peaceful revolution. The statue was brought to the eastern gate of Camp Crime, the police headquarters, where the rebel military leaders, Defense Secretary Juan Ponce Enrile and Lieutenant General Fidel Ramos, were confined during the standoff. The image of Our Lady, the same image whose intercession had been invoked against Dutch warships 340 years earlier, now stood between unarmed civilians and the machinery of state power. The parallels were lost on no one. In 1646, the Rosary had been prayed aboard rotting galleons facing a superior fleet. In 1986, it was prayed on a public highway facing advancing armor. In both cases, the people who prayed had no military advantage whatsoever. In both cases, they believed that the Virgin would intercede. And in both cases, the outcome defied rational expectation. Soldiers who had been ordered to disperse the crowd laid down their weapons. Officers who had been prepared to use force chose not to. Within 4 days, the authoritarian government fell, and a new democratic government was installed without a single shot being fired on EDSA. Many Filipinos, including Cardinal Sin himself, drew a direct line from Lepanto to La Naval to EDSA. 3 moments separated by centuries, connected by a single thread: the Rosary, the intercession of the Virgin, and the faith of a people who had nothing else to rely on. Today, a towering statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary stands at the corner of EDSA and Ortigas Avenue, near the site of the 1986 revolution. It is called Our Lady of EDSA, Mary Queen of Peace, and its presence there is a permanent reminder of what the Filipino people believe: that when everything else fails, when the warships are too many, when the tanks are too heavy, when the odds are too long, there is still the Rosary, and there is still the Mother who hears it. We have told the story of what happened. Now let us consider, for a moment, what might have happened if the Dutch had won the battles of 1646, if those two rotting galleons had been sunk, if Manila had fallen, if the Philippines had been absorbed into the Dutch East Indies. What would the Philippines look like today? The comparison is not hypothetical. We have a real-world example: Indonesia. The Dutch did conquer Indonesia. They ruled the archipelago for roughly 350 years. And the religious landscape of Indonesia today tells us what Dutch colonial rule produced. Indonesia is the largest Muslim-majority nation on Earth, with approximately 87% of its population identifying as Muslim. Dutch colonial policy, unlike Spanish policy, did not prioritize Christian evangelization. The VOC was a commercial enterprise, not a missionary one. They were interested in spices and trade monopolies, not in converting souls. Islam, which had been spreading through the Indonesian archipelago since the 13th century, continued to grow under Dutch rule largely unimpeded. Now look at the Philippines under Spanish rule, which survived the Dutch threat of 1646. The Philippines became the only predominantly Christian nation in Asia. Today, approximately 85% of Filipinos are Catholic. The faith shapes everything from the fiestas that mark the calendar year to the values that define family life to the way Filipinos understand suffering, hope, and community. If the Dutch had taken Manila in 1646, none of this would exist. The Philippines might have become another predominantly Muslim nation in Southeast Asia. Islam was already established in Mindanao and Sulu, and without active Spanish missionary work, it would likely have continued to spread northward. Or the Philippines might have become a religiously mixed society without a dominant faith, as some other former Dutch colonies did. What it almost certainly would not have become is what it is today. A nation where the Rosary is a household prayer, where the Santo Niño is a beloved companion, where the faith runs so deep that millions of people can be mobilized by a cardinal's call to pray. The battles of 1646 did not just decide a military outcome. They decided a civilizational one. They determined whether the Philippines would be shaped by the spiritual legacy of Catholic Spain, or by the commercial pragmatism of Calvinist Holland. And that determination echoes in every church bell that rings in every barrio across these 7,000 islands. Every year, on the second Sunday of October, the streets of Quezon City come alive with one of the most spectacular religious processions in the Catholic world. More than 300,000 people join the celebration of the feast of Our Lady of the Most Holy Rosary, Naval de Manila. The procession begins at the Santo Domingo Church, the national shrine of Our Lady of the Most Holy Rosary, and winds through the streets of the city, with the ancient ivory statue carried in an elaborate carriage, accompanied by images of Dominican saints, clouds of flowers, and the sound of hundreds of thousands of voices praying the Rosary. Since 2023, the feast has been observed as a proper solemnity in Quezon City, the highest liturgical classification, reserved for the most important celebrations of the Church. It is not merely a local tradition, it is a declaration, renewed each year, that the Filipino people have not forgotten what happened in their waters nearly 4 centuries ago. The national artist for literature, Nick Joaquin, perhaps the greatest Filipino writer of the 20th century, chose to end his masterwork, a portrait of the artist as Filipino, with the Naval procession. For Joaquin, the procession was not just a religious event. It was a symbol of Filipino civilization itself, the meeting point of Asian, European, and indigenous cultures, expressed through faith. And every October, when the statue is carried through the streets, it is carried past people who know the story. People who grew up hearing about the 2 rotting galleons and the 18 warships. People who know about the fire ships and the rosary beads. People who remember EDSA. People who understand that this procession is not a commemoration of something that ended. It is a continuation of something that has never stopped. As someone who has spent decades studying the history of Catholic Philippines, I want to share something that this story means to me personally. There are many ways to interpret the events of 1646. The military historian can point to the advantages of fighting in familiar waters, the skill of the Spanish Filipino crews, the tactical errors of the Dutch. The secular scholar can note the role of weather, currents, and the inherent unpredictability of naval combat. These are valid observations, and this account has tried to present the military details honestly. But here is what I cannot get past. No matter how many times I study this history, 15 men, across 5 battles against 18 warships, with 2 cargo ships that were already falling apart. The math does not work. The logistics do not work. The military science does not work. And I think that is the point. The Catholic tradition teaches that God does not always intervene in dramatic, unmistakable ways. Miracles, when they occur, are usually subtle enough that those who choose not to believe can find alternative explanations. The Church does not demand that you accept this supernatural dimension of La Naval. It invites you to consider it. It presents the evidence and allows you to draw your own conclusions. But what is undeniable, what no interpretation can take away, is what this story reveals about the power of faith in the lives of ordinary people. The men who sailed on those galleons were not saints. They were soldiers, sailors, merchants, and volunteers. They were afraid. They knew the odds, and yet they prayed. They prayed not as a last resort, not as a superstitious ritual, but as a disciplined, daily, communal act of trust in something greater than their own strength. And the people of Manila, the women and children and old men in the churches, praying before the exposed Blessed Sacrament while their husbands and fathers and sons were at sea, they were doing the same thing. They were choosing to believe that prayer matters, that the invisible is as real as the visible, that a rosary bead, held between trembling fingers, connects a human soul to the heart of God. For me, there are several lessons in this story that speak to our lives today. The first lesson is about the power of community prayer. The men aboard those ships did not pray alone. They prayed together, in organized choirs, on their knees, every day, for 6 months. And the people of Manila prayed with them, in every church, around the clock. La Naval was not the miracle of one holy person. It was the miracle of a praying community. The second lesson is about faith in impossible situations. There are moments in every life when the odds are insurmountable, when the problem is too big, the resources too small, the opposition too powerful. La Naval reminds us that God does not calculate odds the way we do. 2 rotting ships can be enough if they are entrusted to the right hands. The third lesson is about identity. The Philippines is what it is today, a nation of deep, resilient, joyful Catholic faith because of moments like La Naval. The faith is not an imported accessory. It is the foundation. It is the thing that held the nation together when everything else was falling apart. And it continues to hold it together today. The fourth lesson is about the Rosary itself. From Lepanto to La Naval to EDSA, the Rosary has been the constant. Not because the beads have magical power, but because the prayer they represent the meditation on the life of Christ. Through the eyes of his mother connects human weakness to divine strength. The Rosary is not a weapon of war. It is a weapon of trust. It says, I cannot do this alone. I place myself in your hands. And the fifth lesson is perhaps the most personal. Our Lady of La Naval has Asian features. She was carved by a Chinese artist on Philippine soil for a Spanish patron. And her face reflects the blending of cultures that is the Philippines itself. She is not European Mary. She is not Chinese Mary. She is Filipino Mary. She is the mother who looks like the people she protects. And that is not an accident. It is a message. The faith is not foreign. It is ours. It has been ours for nearly 500 years. And it will remain ours for as long as we choose to kneel before it. Nearly 400 years ago, Two rotting ships sailed out of Cavite to meet an impossible enemy. Their crews carried borrowed cannons and worn-out swords, but they also carried rosary beads, and they carried the unshakable conviction that the Mother of God was sailing with them. History says they won. Faith says they were never alone, and every October, when the ivory statue is carried through the streets of Quezon City past the families, and the flowers, and the candles, and the prayers, the Philippines remembers. It remembers that some victories cannot be measured in firepower, some battles cannot be won by strategy, and some stories, no matter how improbable they seem, are true. This has been the story of Our Lady of La Naval de Manila. Thank you for listening. And if this story touched you in any way, if it made you curious, or moved you, or reminded you of something you had forgotten, please share it. Subscribe to this channel so we can continue bringing you these stories of Catholic Philippine history that the world needs to hear. Leave a comment and tell us, did you know about La Naval before today? And if you are a Filipino, wherever you are in the world, take a moment to pray the Rosary today. Not because you have to, but because your ancestors did. And because of them, you are who you are. Viva la Virgen del Rosario. Viva la Naval de Manila. God bless the Philippines. God bless all of you.